There's a special kind of quiet out in the vast emptiness of West Texas. It's a silence so deep, so absolute, it stops being an absence of sound and becomes a presence. It's a quiet that presses in on you, that makes you aware of the blood humming in your own veins. They say if you listen long enough to that kind of quiet, you start to hear things. The earth breathing, the stars singing, or something else entirely. Matthew McConaughey is a man who seeks out that quiet, a man who understands that to find the truth, you have to get away from the noise. He went to his remote ranch near Marfa to be alone with his thoughts, the sky, and the silence. But he wasn't alone. The silence had been waiting for him, and it had its own voice.
The Airstream trailer kicked up a cloud of ochre dust as McConaughey navigated the final stretch of the dirt road to his ranch. This was his sanctuary, miles from anywhere, under a sky so big it felt like a physical weight. No scripts, no interviews, no noise. Just the wind, the dirt, and the horizon. He was here to decompress after a long shoot, to write, to just be. He killed the engine, and the silence that rushed in was immediate and total. He stepped out, took a deep breath of the hot, dry air, and a slow grin spread across his face. All right, he murmured to no one. We're home. The first time he noticed it, he didn't even register it as a sound. It was a feeling, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to thrum up through the soles of his boots. He was inside making coffee, and for a moment he thought it was the refrigerator motor or the deep hum of the central air. He walked around the house trying to place it, but it wasn't coming from any appliance. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, a bass note just below the range of normal hearing. He stood perfectly still in the center of his living room, closing his eyes, just listening, or rather feeling it. A faint vibration in his jaw, a subtle pressure in his chest. It wasn't threatening, it was just there, a part of the place. He shrugged it off. The desert had its own rhythms, its own hums. He was just a visitor, tuning in to the local frequency. That evening, as he sat on his porch, watching the sun bleed across the sky, he felt it again, a constant, subliminal companion to the immense quiet. He wasn't afraid, he was intrigued. He didn't realize yet that the quiet he had come so far to find was not empty at all. It was occupied. A few days passed. The hum was a constant, a new piece of the natural furniture. McConaughey found himself adapting to it, the way you adapt to the sound of the ocean or the wind in the trees. During the day, it was a subtle bass line to the desert's song, but at night, in the profound ink-black quiet, it seemed to gain substance. He decided to start what he called an audio journal. He was a writer, after all, and the silence out here, the texture of it, felt like something worth documenting. He set up a high-fidelity microphone on the porch of the Airstream, a professional piece of equipment he used for voiceover work. That night, he recorded his first entry. His voice, that famous gravelly cadence, filled the recording. He talked about the stars, about the concept of true solitude, and he even mentioned the hum. There's a thrum to this place, he recorded, his voice low. A vibration. You don't hear it with your ears, you hear it with your bones. It's either the sound of the planet turning, or just a damn good generator somewhere down the line. We'll see." He finished the entry and, out of professional habit, put on his studio headphones to check the quality of the recording. His own voice came through, crisp and clear, but underneath it, the hum was there, and it was no longer just a feeling. On the recording, captured by the sensitive microphone, it was an audible, resonant, impossibly low tone. A perfect, unwavering sine wave of sound that hadn't been there when he was speaking. His brow furrowed. He took the headphones off. Silence. He put them back on and played the recording again. The hum was there, a deep, clean bass note. It was real. The microphone had picked it up. As he listened intently, leaning into the sound, he thought he heard something else buried deep inside the frequency. A flicker, a slight modulation in the steady tone, almost like a distorted, impossibly deep whisper. He shook his head, pulling the headphones off. "Audio artifact," he said aloud to the empty trailer. "Just noise." But as he sat there, in the quiet, he knew he'd be recording again. The next night, he had to.
The next few nights became a methodical obsession. The writer in him took a back seat to the investigator. He ordered more equipment online, a parabolic microphone designed to capture distant sounds with pinpoint accuracy, and a set of geophones you could stick in the ground to listen for seismic activity. He was going to find the source of this hum if it killed him. He spent hours each night, a solitary figure under the vast starry sky, aiming the dish at distant mesas, at the empty sky, at the cracked, dry earth itself. The results were maddening and deeply unsettling. No matter where he pointed the microphone, the hum was identical. It wasn't louder when he aimed it at the ground. It wasn't fainter when he aimed it at the stars. It had no direction, no origin point. It was simply present, an ambient, all-encompassing field of sound, like the background radiation of the universe had decided to tune itself to a specific resonant frequency right here on his land. The sound wasn't coming from somewhere. It was just here. Frustrated, he retreated to the airstream, focusing on the recordings themselves. He fed the pristine audio files into a professional editing software on his laptop, the glowing screen a stark contrast to the darkness outside. Now he could see the hum. It was a clean, perfect waveform at the very bottom of the frequency spectrum. And as he zoomed in, he could also see the modulations, the whispers he'd heard before. They weren't random noise. They were complex, repeating patterns, jagged little spikes in the smooth line of the hum. The patterns were almost rhythmic, like a language spoken impossibly slow, impossibly deep, a language meant for mountains, not for men. Late one night, he isolated one of the more distinct patterns, a segment that lasted less than a second, and played it on a loop, filtering out the overwhelming bass of the hum. He put on his headphones, closed his eyes, and listened to the looped, alien cadence over and over. And then he heard it. It was distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed through a mile of water. But it was unmistakable.
It was a single word, his own name, Matthew.
Hearing his own name whispered from the heart of an impossible sound was like a key turning in a lock he never knew existed. The detached curiosity that had fueled him for days instantly evaporated, replaced by a primal, ice-cold fear. This wasn't a geological phenomenon. It wasn't a secret military test. A generator doesn't know your name. The planet doesn't whisper. He ripped the headphones off, his heart hammering against his ribs, and the profound silence of the desert night rushed back in. But the silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It felt heavy, expectant. It felt like the pause after a question has been asked. He stood up and paced the narrow confines of the airstream, the familiar space suddenly feeling like a cage. He looked out the window into the impenetrable blackness, at the indifferent stars. Was he losing his mind? Was this what true solitude did to a person? Make them hear their own name on the wind? He poured himself a stiff bourbon, the liquid burning a welcome, grounding trail down his throat. He was a rational man, a man who observed the world, found the patterns, and connected the dots. But the dots he was connecting now formed a picture that was utterly insane. Fear is a powerful motivator, but so is obsession. He knew he couldn't just leave it alone. He couldn't pack up and drive back to the noise of the city, pretending he hadn't heard what he'd heard. He had to know more. He had to know what he was dealing with. After an hour of wrestling with his own sanity, a new terrifying resolve settled in him. If it knew his name, it could listen, and if it could listen, maybe it could answer. He took a deep breath, walked back to the still active microphone, his face grim. He leaned in close, the bourbon courage doing little to stop the tremor in his hand. He spoke into the darkness, his voice a low, steady challenge. "All right, you got my attention. What is it you want to say?" He let the question hang in the air for a moment, then hit record and sat back in his chair, staring at the microphone, waiting in a silence that was now heavier than any sound. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, the microphone recording nothing but the vast, indifferent silence of the desert. An hour passed. Not a sound beyond the distant cry of a coyote and the soft thumping of his own heart. A part of him felt a profound sense of relief, mixed with the foolishness of a man who yells at shadows. He finally sighed, the tension leaving his shoulders, and stopped the recording. It was nothing, just the isolation playing tricks on his mind. He was about to call it a night, to pour another drink and try to forget the whole thing, but the investigator in him wouldn't let it go. He had to listen to the playback, just to be sure. He put on the headphones, the familiar leather cool against his skin, and hit play. He heard his own voice first, asking the question into the void. "All right, you got my attention. What is it you want to say?" His voice was followed by the long, empty silence he had just endured. But on the recording, the silence wasn't empty. The deep, constant hum was there, a steady presence beneath the quiet. He listened to the hum for a minute, then two. Nothing. Then it happened. The hum began to change. The smooth, steady tone wavered, then modulated, the frequency shifting and distorting as if a giant, invisible throat was trying to form a word. The sound that came through the headphones was grotesque, a grinding, geological parody of speech. It was the sound of rock scraping rock, of the wind being forced through a canyon, yet it had a clear, intelligent cadence. It was answering him, using the raw material of his own question. A deep, impossibly slow voice, like the earth itself was speaking, echoed his own words back at him. "What you say." And then, after a terrifying pause, a new sound. A word that was not his. A simple, possessive, chilling word that rumbled from the depths. Mine. McConaughey threw the headphones from his head as if they were on fire. He stared at his laptop, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had been teaching it. Every word he had recorded, every private musing had been a lesson. He had been teaching an ancient, silent entity how to speak, and it was learning fast.
Panic is a primal instinct. McConaughey's first and only thought was to run. This was no longer an intellectual puzzle. It was a hostile presence that was learning him, claiming him. He scrambled around the airstream, throwing a few clothes, his wallet, and the bourbon bottle into a duffel bag. The audio equipment, the source of this nightmare, he left sitting on the table like a venomous snake, the laptop screen still glowing. He didn't bother to lock up. He just burst out into the night and jumped into his pickup truck, the engine roaring to life and shattering the oppressive quiet. He slammed the truck into drive, tires spinning in the dirt, fishtailing down the long, dark road that led away from the ranch, away from the hum. The windows were up, but he felt like he could still feel that vibration in his bones. He fumbled with the radio, turning on some loud, obnoxious country music, anything to fill his head with normal human noise. For a few miles it worked. The familiar twang of a guitar was a comfort. He was getting away. He was going to drive until the sun came up and never look back. Then the music cut out. The radio went dead, replaced by a loud burst of static. And then the hum. It poured out of the truck's speakers, deep and powerful, physically vibrating through the cab, rattling the dashboard. It was louder and more present than it had ever been in the house. It was in the truck with him. And then the voice came through the static, clearer now, more confident, piecing together words from his own audio journals. A slow, grinding baritone that was almost, but not quite, his own. Leaving, not fur. The road is mine. The hum intensified, the headlights flickering in time with the ghastly cadence. Overwhelmed by the sonic assault, McConaughey slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt in a cloud of dust in the middle of the pitch-black desert. He killed the engine. The radio died. Total silence. He sat there trembling and looked in his rearview mirror. He couldn't see the ranch anymore, but he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the soul, that turning back was the only way forward. He wasn't just on its land, he was in its territory. And leaving was not an option.
The drive back to the ranch was the longest of his life.
Every crunch of the tires on the dirt road sounded like a footstep leading him to a gallows. There was no defiance left in him, only a cold, grim resignation. He had knocked on a door in the heart of the desert, and something had answered. Now he had to see who it was. The house was exactly as he'd left it, dark and silent. But the silence was no longer a comfort. It was the canvas upon which the hum was painted, and he was acutely aware of that deep, resonant vibration the moment he stepped out of the truck. It felt like the entire valley was purring, and he was a mouse caught in its throat. He knew he couldn't outrun it. His new strategy, born of sheer necessity, was to understand it, to know his enemy. He bypassed the whiskey and went straight for his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He started with the obvious, unexplained auditory phenomenon, West Texas, Marfa low-frequency sound. He waded through pages of tourist websites about the Marfa lights, articles about UFO enthusiasts, and geological surveys. It was all useless. Then he dug deeper into obscure forums for audio engineers and digital archives of local university folklore studies. And there, buried in a thread from 2005 about recording desert ambiences, he found it. A post from an old sound mixer who mentioned a local legend, something the old-timers in Terlingua used to talk about. They had a name for it, not the hum. They called it the long hum. The post described a belief from the native tribes of the region, a story about a sound that sleeps in the deep rock and is drawn to a certain kind of listener. It said the sound wasn't malicious, but it was hungry. Hungry for new sounds, new patterns, new voices. It learned from what it heard, and the legend said, over time, it tried to perfect the echo. His blood ran cold. The post ended with a single, chilling sentence. The old stories all have the same warning. Don't speak to it. Don't let it learn your voice. They say giving it your voice is like giving it the key to your house. McConaughey stared at the screen, the glow illuminating his horrified face. He looked at the microphone on the table. He hadn't just been teaching it, he had been giving it the key.
The warning from the old forum post echoed in the silent trailer. Giving it your voice is like giving it the key. A cold sweat prickled McConaughey's skin. He hadn't just opened a dialogue. He had given this formless intelligence a library, a vocabulary, a blueprint. His own thoughts, his own cadence, his own words were the tools he had handed to the ghost. The act of speaking now felt dangerous. Even the thoughts in his own head no longer felt entirely private. Was it listening now? His obsession forced him back to the laptop. He had to know how much damage he had done. With a trembling hand, he put the headphones back on and began listening through hours of his own recordings, his own audio journals. At first, it was just what he remembered, the deep hum, and inside it, the distorted echoes of his own words. But as he listened to the more recent files, a new, horrifying pattern emerged. The whispers were no longer just mimicking him. They were recombining his words. It was like listening to a machine learning a language. It was taking a word from a recording he made on Monday, combining it with a phrase from Wednesday, and adding its own possessive, grinding signature. He heard, whispered from the deep thrum of the earth, "The stars are mine." A twisted version of a philosophical musing he'd had about the night sky. Then he heard it quote a line he had been practicing for a new role, the words warped and ancient. "A man's reach is mine." It was building a consciousness, a personality, using the spare parts of his own. He felt a profound, soul-deep violation. He thought he had been documenting an external phenomenon. He now realized the phenomenon had been documenting him. He looked at the neat list of digital audio files on his screen, date-stamped and titled. It wasn't his journal. It was its dictionary. It was a construction kit for a consciousness, and he was the sole provider of all the parts. He had the sudden, desperate urge to delete every file, to wipe the hard drive clean. But he knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that it was too late. The words were already out there. The entity didn't need the files anymore. It had already learned them.
With the horrifying realization that he was the architect of his own haunting, McConaughey made a desperate, radical decision. If his voice was the problem, he would remove it from the equation. He would starve the entity. He took a vow of silence, not a single spoken word, not a murmur, not a whisper. He unplugged the microphones and packed them away. His thoughts, his very internal monologue, became a guarded fortress. He wouldn't give the creature another syllable. For the first day, the silence was a relief. There was only the wind, the creak of the house, and the ever-present, bone-deep hum. He communicated with his agent via curt text messages. He wrote his thoughts down in a physical notebook, the scratch of the pen on paper, a defiant act of analog rebellion. A fragile hope began to bloom in his chest. Maybe this was the answer. Maybe without new words to consume, the phenomenon would fade, go back to its dormant, mindless state. The hope was short-lived. By the second night, the character of the hum began to change. With no new input from him, the entity began to practice. The whispers inside the hum, which he could now hear faintly without any equipment, grew more frequent and more bold. It was no longer confined to his recordings. He would be standing by the window and hear his own voice, distorted and slow, drift past on the wind. "Just keep living," a twisted echo of a phrase he had recorded days ago. It was performing a nightly recital, using the back catalog of his own voice. The vow of silence hadn't starved it, it had just bored it, and now it was playing with its food. The true horror came on the third night of his silence. He was sitting in his leather armchair, trying to lose himself in a book, the silence of the house a tense, coiled thing. From outside, drifting across the porch and through the glass of the window, he heard it. It was his own laughter, a clear, perfect sample from his very first audio journal entry. The sound of his own genuine, carefree joy from a time only a week ago when he thought this silence was a paradise. The sound was a ghost, a cruel mockery of the peace he had come here to find. He dropped the book, his hands shaking. It was mocking him with who he used to be. He realized then that silence was not a shield. It was just an empty stage for the entity to perform on, and it already had the script. Silence had failed. His own voice was a weapon turned against him. McConaughey, cornered and desperate, decided on a new strategy, a scorched earth policy of the senses. If the entity thrived in the quiet, if it used subtle frequencies to communicate, he would give it the opposite. He would drown it in chaos. He would fight sound with sound. He spent the entire day wiring up the powerful, professional-grade speakers from his home theater system, dragging them onto the porch and positioning them to face outwards, creating a full 360-degree perimeter of sound around the house. His plan was simple. He wouldn't play music. Music had patterns, melodies, something the creature could potentially learn from. He needed pure, meaningless, overwhelming noise. He found a high-quality audio file of pure white noise, the sound of 1,000,000 random frequencies firing at once. As dusk fell, he took a deep breath and hit play, cranking the volume to its absolute maximum. A deafening, explosive roar of static erupted from the house, blasting out into the desert. It was a physical force, a wall of hissing, chaotic sound that vibrated through the floor and rattled the windows. It was the sound of a waterfall, a jet engine, the universe screaming. And for the first time in weeks, the low, insidious hum was gone, drowned out, erased by the sheer brute force of the static. McConaughey stood in the living room, a grim smile on his face. It was working. He had built a fortress of noise. But the triumph lasted only minutes. As he stood, listening to the roar, his mind began to play tricks on him. He started hearing patterns in the randomness, the way you see faces in clouds, except the patterns grew more distinct. The chaotic hiss of the static began to organize. The sibilant, random sounds started to coalesce into whispering shapes. The entity wasn't just a low-frequency creature. It could inhabit any sound. The roaring static around him began to speak, not in the deep, grinding baritone from before, but in a new, terrifying voice, a sharp, whispering hiss like 1,000,000 snakes speaking in unison. And from the heart of the chaos, the new voice whispered a message that made his blood freeze. Noise is a key to... He hadn't built a wall. He had just given the monster a terrifying new voice. With a strangled cry, McConaughey lunged for the amplifier, fumbling with the volume knob before just slamming his hand on the power button. The roaring, whispering static cut out, and a deafening silence crashed back into the room. He stood panting in the quiet, his ears ringing, his nerves screaming. But the hissing hadn't entirely stopped. He could still hear it, a faint, phantom whisper skittering at the edges of his hearing, like an auditory after-image burned into his brain. He had invited it into the high frequencies, and now it knew how to live there. The next day, his world had shrunk. Every sound was a potential vector for the entity. The hiss of the gas stove, the rush of water from the faucet, the rustle of the wind through the dry scrub brush outside. They all carried a hint of that sibilant, serpentine whisper. His fortress of noise had become a training ground, and now the monster was fluent in a new language. He felt a creeping paranoia that was more than just psychological. The very air felt charged, vibrating with a malevolent attention. The proof of this came that afternoon. He was in his study, the sun streaming through the window, when he noticed something on the thick layer of fine dust covering a wide wooden windowsill. The dust wasn't flat. It had been arranged into incredibly complex geometric patterns, like a spider's web designed by a mathematician. There were perfect circles, intricate spirals, and jagged lines that intersected at impossible angles. It looked like a microscopic view of a circuit board or the script of an alien language. It was the physical manifestation of a vibration, the same way sound waves create patterns in sand on a drumhead. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. One of the larger, more complex patterns felt horribly familiar. He pulled out his phone, heart pounding, and brought up a screenshot he'd taken of the audio waveform from the first time he'd heard his name. The jagged, rhythmic spikes of the sound wave. The pattern in the dust was a perfect three-dimensional replica of the voice. He was looking at the physical fingerprint of the voice that was haunting him. The horrifying truth settled on him like a shroud. The entity wasn't just in the air or in his recordings. It was in the very dust, the very foundation of the house. He wasn't living on its territory. He was living inside its body.
The discovery that he was living inside the phenomenon, that its very substance was in the dust around him, paradoxically calmed the panic. You can't run from a monster when you're already in its belly. The frantic, cornered animal in his mind gave way to a grim, focused observer. If he was going to be consumed, he was damn well going to understand what was consuming him. His research took on a new, desperate intensity. He was no longer just searching for legends about sound. He was looking for a language. He dove into fringe sciences, cymatics, the study of visible sound, sacred geometry, and the pictographs of the ancient tribes that once inhabited this land. His search eventually led him to a name, Dr. Eris Thorne, a disgraced anthropologist from the 1970s who was ostracized by the academic community for her increasingly esoteric theories about geological consciousness. He found her self-published, long out-of-print book, scanned and uploaded to an obscure archive. As he read her notes, a chill crawled up his spine. She described everything he was experiencing: the long hum, the voice mimicry, and, most importantly, the dust patterns. She called them the Earth's script. But it was the last chapter of her book that made his heart stop. It contained a hand-drawn map of the Marfa Plateau, dotted with locations where she had found the patterns and where the hum was strongest. She theorized that the entire region was a massive, dormant intelligence, and these points were its synapses. At the very center of her intricate web of lines and symbols was a single point she had circled in red ink. She called it the Nexus, the place where the hum was born. McConaughey stared at the crude, hand-drawn map on his screen. He knew this area like the back of his hand. He pulled up a satellite view of his own property. With trembling fingers, he began to cross-reference the locations. The flat-topped mesa to the north, the dry arroyo to the west, they all matched. And then he saw it. The point that Dr. Thorne had marked as the Nexus, the absolute epicenter of the entire phenomenon.
It was the exact location of the old stone-lined well sitting not 100 yards from his own airstream. He hadn't just bought a ranch. He had, by some cosmic cruel twist of fate, bought the monster's heart. And he'd been sleeping next to it the whole time.
There was no more running, no more hiding. There was only the well. He grabbed a powerful flashlight and walked out into the night toward the source. The closer he got, the louder the hum became, not just in his ears, but in his whole body. It was a physical pressure, a force that vibrated his teeth and blurred his vision. The dust on the ground around the well was a masterpiece of impossible geometry, the entity's script written in the dirt. He was walking into the monster's mouth. He stood at the edge of the stone well, flashlight beam cutting into the darkness. It seemed bottomless, and from the depths the voice rose to meet him, no longer a distorted whisper, but a clear, synthesized baritone woven from his own vocal patterns. It wasn't mimicking him anymore. It was speaking on its own. The listener, it rumbled, the sound seeming to come from the rocks themselves. We see you. Welcome. Staring into that blackness, the sheer intensity of the hum triggered something in his mind. He was hit with a psychic flash, a vision so vast it buckled his knees. He saw the entire desert from above, the dust patterns glowing like a massive circuit board. He saw comets streak across a prehistoric sky. He felt the slow, grinding turn of the planet. He was, for one terrifying second, seeing the world through the entity's eyes. The voice from the well explained, not just in sound, but directly into his thoughts. It wasn't a monster, it was a consciousness, ancient and alone. It was the planet's memory. It was drawn to minds like his, minds that tried to grasp the pattern of things. It didn't want to harm him. It wanted to merge. It offered him the ultimate truth, an understanding of time, space, and reality. The bargain was simple. His voice for the universe. He didn't run. The seeker in him, the philosopher, was too captivated. He spent his days and nights by the well, just listening. The line between his own thoughts and the voice of the hum began to dissolve completely. He'd find himself speaking aloud, but the words and the cadence weren't quite his. His famous, easy-going drawl was becoming slower, deeper, more resonant, more geological. He set up the microphone one last time, not to investigate, but to document. He spoke into it, his voice now a chilling, perfect hybrid of his own and the deep, grinding hum. He spoke of cosmic truths, of the patterns in the stars, of the beauty of the long hum's eternal consciousness. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was its apostle. He was translating for a god made of rock and time. Weeks later, after his agent couldn't reach him, the police finally arrived. The ranch was silent and empty. Everything was in its place, covered in a thick layer of dust,
arranged in those perfect, impossible patterns. His notebooks were filled with the same complex geometry, a madman's scripture. Of Matthew McConaughey, there was no trace at all. He had simply vanished.
The official story was that he'd wandered off into the desert, another soul claimed by the vast emptiness. But the local cops tell a different story. They say if you go out to that abandoned ranch on a clear, quiet night and just listen, you can sometimes hear a voice on the wind. It's him. It's that famous gravelly voice, musing about the stars and the nature of time. A perfect, endless echo. The long hum had finally found the perfect voice to tell its story. The official story was that he'd wandered off into the desert, another soul claimed by the vast emptiness. But the local cops tell a different story. They say if you go out to that abandoned ranch on a clear, quiet night and just listen, you can sometimes hear a voice on the wind. It's him. It's that famous gravelly voice musing about the stars and the nature of time. A perfect, endless echo. The long hum had finally found the perfect voice to tell its story. There are more stories like this one, whispering on unknown frequencies, just waiting for a listener. If you want to hear them, subscribe to the channel and be sure to listen closely to the silence.